The first thing people need to understand is that the Ukraine war is no longer a question of public slogans, moral theater, or the kind of emotional language that has dominated Western media for the last several years. This war has reached the point where only hard military reality matters. Russia is not losing. Ukraine is not winning. NATO is not in control of the escalation ladder. And Washington, after years of pretending it could shape the battlefield from a safe distance, is now trying to find a way out of a conflict it helped build, helped sustain, and now cannot easily end without admitting the scale of its own strategic failure. That is the uncomfortable truth behind all this talk about negotiations. When Washington says Ukraine, Europe, and Russia must put forward proposals or the United States may walk away, what it is really admitting is that the old policy has exhausted itself. The idea that Russia could be weakened through Ukraine, isolated economically, broken diplomatically, and forced into retreat militarily has failed. It did not just fail slightly, it failed at the strategic level. Russia adapted, Russia mobilized, Russia absorbed sanctions, Russia reoriented trade, Russia expanded defense production, Russia learned on the battlefield. Ukraine, meanwhile, has been depleted, heavily dependent on Western weapons, and politically trapped by promises its own sponsors cannot fulfill. Now, it is important to be fair. The fact that any American administration is willing to talk to Russia is already a step away from insanity. The previous approach was to cut off serious diplomatic contact, pump weapons into Ukraine, and act as if negotiations were a form of surrender. That was never strategy. That was emotional policy dressed up as resolve. If Washington now recognizes that Russia must be spoken to directly, then that is a positive development. But talking to Russia is not enough. If you talk while still refusing to accept the battlefield reality, then the talks will go nowhere. And this is where the problem begins. Early in this process, there appeared to be some recognition inside Washington that the war did not simply begin in a vacuum. NATO expansion mattered. The collapse of serious diplomacy mattered. The militarization of Ukraine mattered. The constant Western effort to pull Ukraine into an anti-Russian military structure mattered. Russia viewed that process as an existential security threat. Whether people in Washington like that fact or not is irrelevant. Serious analysis begins by understanding how the other side sees its security. If you refuse to understand that, you cannot negotiate. But then Washington does what Washington always does. It acknowledges reality for 5 minutes and then retreats back into political fantasy. It says Russia must make concessions. It says Ukraine must be protected. It says Europe must be reassured. It says NATO cannot appear weak. It says the United States must look like the peacemaker while not admitting that the United States was one of the main architects of the conflict. That is not diplomacy. That is trying to manage blame. Stay with this because the next layer is where the official story begins to fall apart. Russia has no reason to negotiate as if it is the defeated party. Russia is not the defeated party. On the battlefield, Russia holds the strategic advantage. It has greater manpower depth, greater artillery production, a stronger missile industrial base, and more political endurance than the West expected. Ukraine has courage, but courage does not replace ammunition. Courage does not replace air defense interceptors. Courage does not replace trained brigades. Courage does not replace industrial capacity. And courage does not change the fact that Russia can continue this war on terms Ukraine cannot match without permanent Western support. So when Washington approaches Moscow and says, in effect, you must compromise because we want this war to end in a politically convenient way, Moscow has no incentive to accept that logic. Russia did not invite the United States into this war as a neutral mediator. Russia understands that the United States has been a party to the conflict through weapons, intelligence, training, logistics, targeting support, sanctions, and diplomatic cover. The idea that Washington can suddenly walk into the room and present itself as an honest broker is not credible. Russia sees the United States as the sponsor of the other side. That matters. And that is why any settlement that ignores NATO's role is dead on arrival. You cannot say this war was about Ukraine alone when Ukraine was turned into a forward operating platform for a Western strategic project. You cannot say Russia must accept Ukrainian neutrality while NATO continues to arm, train, and integrate Ukrainian forces behind the scenes. You cannot say there should be a ceasefire while Europe keeps shipping weapons and talking about peacekeepers. A ceasefire without a political settlement is not peace. It is a pause for rearmament. Moscow knows this because it has already watched the Minsk process become exactly that, a diplomatic shell used to buy time for Ukraine's military buildup. That is why Russia's demands have been consistent: neutrality, demilitarization, recognition of territorial realities, no NATO membership, no NATO infrastructure, no Western military presence positioned as a permanent threat. These are not new demands. Moscow has repeated them for years. The West dismissed them when Russia was warning. Now the West wants to negotiate them after Russia has gained the upper hand. That is a much weaker position. But if you think that was the dangerous part, what comes next is even more serious. The United States itself does not appear unified on what it wants. You have one camp that understands the war is lost in strategic terms and wants to move towards some kind of normalization with Russia. That camp may understand, at least partially, that the United States has bigger problems than Ukraine. It has China, it has debt, it has industrial weakness, it has military overstretch, it has a hollowed out defense production base, it has a domestic economy under pressure. It cannot afford an endless proxy war in Eastern Europe that produces no achievable strategic victory. Then you have another camp that still thinks in the old NATO framework. This camp believes Ukraine can still be used to weaken Russia. It believes Europe must be held together through confrontation with Moscow. It believes any compromise looks like appeasement. It still speaks the language of the last 3 years: Russian aggression, European unity, standing with Ukraine, defending democracy. But behind that language is a military reality they do not want to admit. Ukraine is running out of options. Europe is running out of credibility, and NATO is running out of a coherent endgame. This split inside Washington is extremely dangerous because it creates contradictory signals. One official says negotiation, another says pressure. One official speaks about realism, another speaks about victory. One channel tells Russia the United States wants to settle, another tells Europe that Washington remains committed. One side says NATO membership is off the table, another side refuses to fully close the door. Moscow sees this, Kyiv sees this, Europe sees this, and when all sides see confusion in Washington, nobody knows which American position is real. That is not strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity can be useful when it is disciplined and deliberate. This is not that. This is policy dysfunction. This is a government trying to move in two directions at once because it cannot admit that the old policy failed, and it cannot fully commit to the new policy because the political cost is too high. That is how great powers drift. They do not always make one dramatic decision. Sometimes they simply fail to choose, and the battlefield chooses for them. Now we need to address the Trump factor directly because it matters. Trump wants to present himself as the man who can end the war. He wants to say this is Biden's war, Obama's failure, Europe's problem, Ukraine's corruption, NATO's mess. There is truth in some of that, but it is incomplete. The United States did not begin militarizing Ukraine only under Biden. The training, arming, intelligence relationships, and covert infrastructure were built across multiple administrations. Trump's first administration expanded lethal military aid. The CIA presence in Ukraine grew. NATO interoperability continued. The strategic objective of using Ukraine as a pressure point against Russia did not begin in 2022. It was years in the making. That means Trump is also trapped by history. He wants to divorce himself from the war, but he cannot fully separate himself from the policy architecture that helped create it. He wants to blame others, but his own administration participated in building Ukraine into a forward platform against Russia. That is why his messaging becomes selective. He focuses on Crimea because Crimea can be blamed on Obama. He can say, this happened before me. Ukraine lost it without firing a shot. Russia has it now. That is reality. Politically, that is easy. It costs him less, but the other territories are different. Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, these are tied to the war that exploded after years of Western involvement and after the political line in Washington hardened. If Trump accepts that Russia will retain these territories, he owns part of that settlement. He becomes the president who accepted what the establishment calls territorial loss. That is why Crimea becomes the convenient focus. It lets him sound realistic without fully confronting the entire reality. And this is where the negotiations become almost impossible. Russia is not negotiating only Crimea. Russia has incorporated new territories into its constitutional framework. Moscow is not going to simply hand them back because Washington wants a cleaner political narrative. People in the West keep speaking as if territory is a bargaining chip that Russia can casually trade. But from Moscow's perspective, that question has already been decided politically, militarily, and legally inside the Russian system. If Washington does not understand that, then it is not negotiating with Russia. It is negotiating with its own fantasy of Russia. And this is where the intelligence picture becomes much darker. Western leaders still seem to believe that Russia needs an off ramp more than the West does. That is an outdated assumption. Russia has paid a heavy price, yes, but Russia has also reorganized for a long war. Its defense industry is active. Its army has gained battlefield experience. Its economy has not collapsed. Its political system has not fractured under sanctions. Its alliances with China, Iran, North Korea, and other non-Western actors have deepened. Russia is not isolated in the way Washington claimed it would be. It is operating in a new global environment where Western pressure no longer produces automatic obedience. Europe, on the other hand, is in a far weaker position than its rhetoric suggests. European leaders talk about sending peacekeepers, but they struggle to generate serious military capacity. They talk about strategic autonomy, but they remain dependent on American intelligence, logistics, airlift, command structures, and nuclear deterrence. They talk about defending Ukraine as long as it takes, but their industries cannot produce enough shells, missiles, and air defense systems at the pace required. They talk like a great power bloc, but they do not behave like one because they are politically divided, economically strained, and militarily fragmented. This is why the idea of European peacekeepers inside Ukraine is so reckless. Peacekeepers after a political settlement are one thing. Western troops inserted into a live conflict zone without Russian consent are not peacekeepers. They are tripwires. They are targets. If European soldiers enter Ukraine under a NATO or quasi-NATO framework, Russia will see them as participants. Then Europe will face the question it has spent years avoiding. Is it prepared to fight Russia directly? The answer is no. Europe is not prepared for that, not militarily, not economically, and not politically. So Europe wants the appearance of toughness without the full burden of war. It wants the United States to remain the backstop. It wants Ukraine to continue fighting. It wants Russia to accept a ceasefire that freezes the battlefield before Ukraine collapses further. It wants negotiations without acknowledging NATO's responsibility. It wants peace without concession. That is not a serious policy. That is an emotional refusal to accept defeat. The United States has the ability to force clarity here if it chooses. Washington could tell Europe directly, Ukraine will not join NATO. NATO will not send forces into Ukraine. NATO will not use a ceasefire to rearm Ukraine for a new round of war. NATO will return to a defensive posture. Europe must stop treating Ukraine as a sacred project and start treating it as a failed strategic gamble. That would be difficult politically, but it would be clear, and clarity is what is missing. Instead, Washington keeps trying to maintain two incompatible positions. It wants better relations with Russia, but it does not want to fully discipline Europe. It wants to end the war, but it does not want to accept Russia's terms. It wants to walk away, but it does not want to look like it abandoned Ukraine. It wants to blame Biden, but it does not want to admit the broader bipartisan failure. It wants to be the peacemaker, but it still wants to preserve the image of American dominance. You cannot have all of that at once. By the end, you will understand why this is not just about Ukraine. It is about credibility, deterrence, and the failure of strategic judgment. The Ukraine war has exposed a much larger problem in Western strategic culture. Western leaders confuse narratives with reality. They believe that saying Russia was isolated would make Russia isolated. They believe that saying Ukraine was winning would make Ukraine win. They believe that calling sanctions crippling would cripple Russia. They believe that repeating as long as it takes would solve the industrial and manpower imbalance. None of that happened. Russia made a hard assessment of its security interests and acted with long-term commitment. The West made emotional declarations and then struggled to build a strategy capable of supporting them. That is why the war has turned. Not because Russia is brilliant in every respect. It made mistakes, it suffered losses, it adapted painfully, but it adapted. The West did not adapt fast enough because the West was trapped inside its own propaganda. The propaganda problem matters because it affects negotiation. If you tell your public for years that Russia is weak, irrational, isolated, losing, and on the verge of collapse, then it becomes politically difficult to explain why you now need to negotiate with Russia as the stronger military actor. If you tell your public that Ukraine is defending all of Europe, then it becomes difficult to explain why Europe must accept Ukraine's neutrality. If you tell your public that compromise is appeasement, then every realistic settlement looks like betrayal. That is how propaganda becomes a prison. Ukraine is also trapped by this. Zelensky and the Ukrainian political class were encouraged to believe that the West would support them until victory. But what does victory mean now? Returning to 1991 borders? Impossible. Joining NATO? Russia will not allow it. Defeating Russia militarily? Not realistic. Maintaining a large militarized anti-Russian state on Russia's border, also not acceptable to Moscow. So Ukraine is trapped between Western promises and Russian military reality. That is a tragic position, but it is the result of policy choices. The harsh truth is that the terms available to Ukraine today are likely better than the terms available later. That has been true at multiple points in this war. The longer Ukraine fights under unrealistic assumptions, the more territory it risks losing, the more infrastructure is destroyed, the more manpower is depleted, and the weaker its negotiating position becomes. This is not cruelty, this is war. War punishes delayed reality. Russia does not need American approval to continue. That is another fact Washington must understand. If the United States walks away, Russia continues. If Europe keeps sending weapons, Russia continues. If Ukraine refuses talks, Russia continues. If Washington proposes terms Russia considers inadequate, Russia continues. The Russian military objective is not dependent on Western emotional acceptance. Moscow believes it is fighting for core security interests, and states do not usually compromise core security interests when they believe they are winning. This is why the American threat to walk away may not pressure Russia the way Washington thinks. Russia might welcome it. If the United States reduces weapons, intelligence, logistics, and political backing, Ukraine's position worsens. If Europe tries to fill the gap, it will discover how dependent it truly is. If NATO fractures over burden sharing, Russia benefits. So the threat to walk away pressures Kyiv and Europe more than Moscow. That is the reality. The real question is whether Trump is willing to make that threat real, not just rhetorically, not just on social media, not just as negotiation theater. Real walking away means cutting off the mechanisms that keep Ukraine in the fight: weapons, intelligence, targeting support, financial support, diplomatic cover, training, logistics. If those continue, then Washington has not walked away. It has only changed the language. And if Washington keeps support flowing while claiming it wants peace, Russia will assume the United States is simply buying time for Ukraine again. That is why Moscow will not accept a ceasefire without political settlement. It has learned from experience. The West used agreements before to strengthen Ukraine. Russia will not allow the same mistake to repeat itself. Anyone who does not understand that does not understand why diplomacy has failed. Now let us talk about NATO. NATO must decide what it is. If NATO is a defensive alliance, then it should return to defensive posture, protect member states, avoid expansion into conflict zones, stop using partner states as forward pressure points, stop pretending every regional dispute is a NATO mission. But if NATO continues acting as an offensive geopolitical instrument, pushing military infrastructure toward Russia and treating Ukraine as a permanent proxy platform, then conflict with Russia will continue. Moscow has already made clear that this is unacceptable. A serious American policy would tell Europe NATO survives only if it becomes defensive again. The United States will not allow NATO to be used as a mechanism for endless escalation. Europe must stop imagining that American power exists to underwrite European fantasies. If Europe wants confrontation with Russia, Europe can pay for it, arm it, man it, and absorb the consequences. But the United States should not continue sacrificing its strategic focus for a European project that cannot define victory. That does not mean America must abandon Europe completely. The United States and Europe have deep historical, economic, and cultural ties. A complete divorce is not realistic. But there is a difference between alliance and dependency. Europe has become dependent on American power while simultaneously making reckless strategic decisions. That is not partnership, that is liability. If the United States remains in NATO, it must impose discipline. It must prevent Europe from dragging the alliance into wars it cannot win. The European Union also has its own internal problem. It speaks about democracy while pressuring member states that dissent from Brussels' preferred line. Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and others have shown that Europe is not united in the way Brussels pretends. National interests still exist. Sovereignty still exists. Populations still have the right to reject policies that lead to economic hardship and war risk. The more Brussels suppresses national dissent in the name of unity, the more fragile Europe becomes. Russia understands these fractures. It does not need to invade Europe to exploit them. It only needs to wait while Europe argues with itself. Energy costs, migration pressures, industrial decline, political polarization, and war fatigue are already doing damage. The Ukraine war did not create all of Europe's problems, but it accelerated them. And now Europe faces the possibility that the United States may reduce its role before Europe has the capacity to stand on its own. That is why European leaders are nervous. They know Ukraine cannot win without the United States. They know Europe cannot replace the United States quickly. They know Russia is advancing. They know their publics are tired. They know their economies are under pressure. But instead of admitting this, they talk about unconditional ceasefires and peacekeepers. That is not strategy. That is delay. The Crimea issue shows the deeper dysfunction. Crimea is treated in Western discussion as if it were a negotiable symbol, but Crimea is not just a symbol for Russia. It is strategic territory, a naval base, a population that Moscow claims is Russian, and a central element of Russia's Black Sea security. Russia will not give it back. Everyone serious knows this. Trump appears to understand this because it is politically convenient for him to say Crimea was lost before him. But if he understands Crimea, he must also understand that Russia views the other territories through a new political and security reality. Selective realism will not work. Negotiations require full realism, not partial realism, not the kind of realism that blames Obama for Crimea but refuses to confront Donbass, not the kind of realism that says NATO membership is impossible but still allows Ukraine to function as a NATO proxy, not the kind of realism that says peace is necessary but keeps Europe in an escalation posture. Full realism means admitting that the West overplayed its hand, that Ukraine's maximalist goals are impossible, and that Russia's security demands must be addressed. That is a bitter pill for Washington, but bitterness is not an argument. The battlefield has already made the argument. The West can either acknowledge it now through negotiation or acknowledge it later under worse conditions. Those are the choices. The danger is that policymakers choose a third path. Pretending Ukraine can still negotiate from strength, pretending Europe is united, pretending NATO has no responsibility, pretending Russia is desperate, pretending a ceasefire without settlement is viable, pretending American internal policy confusion is strategic genius, pretending walking away without changing material support is meaningful, pretending does not end wars, it extends them. And extension means more deaths, more destruction, more territory lost, more economic damage, and greater risk of direct NATO Russia escalation. That last point must be taken seriously. Every additional long range weapon, every intelligence supported strike, every discussion of Western troops, every attack deeper into Russian territory increases the chance of miscalculation. Russia has shown restraint in certain areas, but restraint is not infinite. Great powers eventually respond when they believe their their core security is being threatened. This is the final warning. The Ukraine war is not going to end through slogans. It will not end because Western leaders say Russia must make concessions. It will not end because European officials call every compromise appeasement. It will not end because Washington wants to escape without blame. It will end when the political settlement reflects the military reality. And right now, the military reality favors Russia. If Washington wants a serious settlement, it must discipline its own policy. It must stop sending contradictory signals. It must tell Europe the truth. It must tell Ukraine the truth. It must accept that NATO expansion caused a security crisis that Russia was willing to fight to resolve. It must stop pretending that Russia is obligated to rescue America from the consequences of America's own failed strategy. If Washington refuses to do that, then Russia will continue doing what it is doing on the battlefield. Ukraine will continue losing men and territory. Europe will continue weakening itself in defense of a project it cannot sustain. NATO will become more divided, and the United States will face a choice between deeper escalation and humiliating withdrawal under worse conditions. Bad policy does not become good policy because it is repeated by every television analyst. Failed strategy does not become successful because officials call it moral clarity. And a proxy war does not become winnable because the people who started it are afraid to admit they were wrong. The lesson is simple. You cannot negotiate effectively while lying to yourself. You cannot make peace while refusing to accept why the war began. You cannot end a proxy war while pretending you were not a participant. You cannot demand concessions from the side that holds the advantage and expect serious results. And you cannot lead an alliance if your own policy is split between realism and fantasy. Russia has stated its terms. Ukraine is running out of leverage. Europe is running out of capacity. Washington is running out of time. The only question now is whether American leadership will finally deal with reality or whether it will continue protecting a narrative until the battlefield destroys what is left of it.